as the sun began to rise over the northern coast of France on June 6, 1944. Few German soldiers standing guard along the Atlantic Wall truly understood what was about to descend upon them. The defenses they had built, the bunkers they reinforced, the machine gun nests they maintained day and night. None of it felt any different from the long months of waiting that had defined their duty. But on that morning, the horizon itself seemed to shift. Far out at sea, the silhouettes of countless ships began to appear, dark against the first light of dawn, forming one of the largest armadas the world had ever seen. The German defenders had been told an invasion might come, but no one expected it to arrive with such thunderous force. And no one, least of all the German troops on the ground, expected the role that America's Sherman tanks would play in breaking the fortified beaches they believed were unbreakable. The German commanders had studied tank warfare obsessively. They had fought against Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front, they had observed British armor in North Africa, and they had deployed their feared panzer divisions across Europe. To them, American tanks, the M4 Shermans, were hardly impressive machines. They considered them under-armored, under-gunned, too lightly built to challenge German Panthers, Tigers, and the massive fortifications of the Atlantic Wall. But what they did not understand was that the power of the Shermans did not lie in raw armor or firepower. It lay in numbers, coordination, mobility, and the sheer scale of the Allied invasion. The Germans were about to witness an armored strategy unlike anything they had anticipated. In the hours before the landings, German troops huddled in their concrete bunkers as Allied battleships and cruisers opened fire. The bombardment shook the coastline violently, throwing sand, debris, and fragments of steel into the air. Soldiers clung to their weapons and tried to steady themselves as the ground trembled like a living creature beneath them. Some believed the bombardment alone would annihilate any tanks before they reached the beach. After all, armored vehicles moving across open sand under heavy fire seemed like an impossible feat. But what they couldn't see was the fleet of specially designed landing craft waiting offshore, LCVPS, LCTS, and LSTS, each filled with men, supplies, and dozens of Sherman tanks prepared to storm the French coast. As the bombardment eased and the German machine gunners took their positions again, a new sound rose from the water. Engines, deep, roaring, mechanical, flooded the air. It was the sound of armored vehicles awakening, dozens at first, then hundreds, like a steel heartbeat moving toward the shore. The Germans scanned the haze with their binoculars and saw silhouettes moving behind the wave's tanks. Multiple rows of tanks coming straight for them. Many German soldiers initially laughed or shouted with disbelief. How could tanks possibly reach them across soft sand under intense fire? They expected the landing craft to be destroyed before the armor could even unload. But the Americans had rehearsed this moment for months, designing the assault down to the smallest detail. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, the first Shermans surged forward into the water, some nearly submerged as waves crashed over their hulls. And yet they kept moving. Some were DD Shermans, amphibious tanks equipped with canvas flotation screens that allowed them to swim toward the beaches under their own power. The Germans were stunned. They had never seen tanks swimming. As the floating Shermans approached closer, their screens dropped, exposing their turrets and main guns. The sight of these amphibious tanks emerging from the surf like steel monsters left many German defenders momentarily frozen. They expected infantry. What they saw instead were armored spearheads pushing through the waves. Some tanks sank. The sea took them, but enough survived to make an impact. As the first Shermans rolled onto the sand, their engines roared with determination. Their treads bit into the volcanic-like soil of Normandy's beaches, throwing mud and sand behind them as they pushed forward. German gunners opened fire immediately, machine gun bursts sparking off the Shermans' hulls. Anti-tank guns fired armor-piercing shells that struck with violent force, sometimes punching through, sometimes glancing off at angles. The Germans knew that one well-placed shell could destroy a Sherman, but they were not facing one tank. They were facing many, and more were coming. The Shermans began laying down suppressive fire. Their 75mm guns targeted machine gun nests, their coaxial machine guns peppered German firing slits, and their presence alone shifted the balance of the assault. The infantry that had been pinned down on the sand finally found something to rally behind. American soldiers moved alongside the tanks, using them as mobile shields, advancing inch by inch toward the German positions. This cooperation, tanks and infantry moving as one, was something the German defenders had not anticipated at this scale. The Shermans were not acting alone. They were part of a massive, synchronized assault. German troops inside bunkers felt the impact of the tanks before they even saw them. The rumbling grew louder, closer, shaking the walls like approaching thunder. Dust fell from concrete ceilings. Communications were scrambled as officers demanded updates on enemy armor sightings. The panic spread quickly. Many German troops believed their anti-tank guns would easily hold the line. But the Shermans advanced relentlessly, supported by naval gunfire, artillery, engineers, and air power. For every Sherman knocked out, 2 more appeared behind it. The Germans watched in disbelief as the Americans poured an endless stream of armor onto the beaches. They had never experienced anything like it. As the Shermans pressed forward, they began taking out key strong points. One by one, the bunkers that formed the backbone of the Atlantic Wall came under direct fire. The tanks blasted openings into reinforced concrete, allowing infantry to storm through. German soldiers who had expected hours of dominance suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. The Shermans were not always superior in armor or firepower, but they were unstoppable in presence. They kept coming. Their numbers broke German morale in ways that heavy tanks never could. German troops who had survived years on the Eastern Front later commented that they had never seen so many tanks appear so quickly on such difficult terrain. The beaches of Normandy had been designed to trap, slow, and kill armor. And yet the Shermans broke through faster than anyone had planned. German commanders were stunned. The idea that the Americans could land hundreds of tanks under fire and push inland within hours seemed impossible. But the Shermans were doing exactly that. The tanks pushed past the beach obstacles, navigating through mines, wooden stakes, barbed wire, and steel hedgehogs. Combat engineers worked alongside them, clearing paths and guiding the armor forward. Once off the beach, the Shermans began maneuvering through the Hedgerow country, dense, ancient farmland surrounded by thick earthen walls. The Germans believed the hedgerows would negate Allied armor. But again, the Americans innovated. They welded steel blades and saw-tooth cutters to the front of the tanks, allowing Shermans to punch through hedgerows like living bulldozers. German troops hiding behind hedgerows, expecting safe cover, suddenly watched in horror as the earth itself split open and a Sherman burst through, firing at point-blank range. The psychological shock was immense. Tanks that were never expected to function well in the Normandy terrain were now appearing from directions no German soldier thought possible. The battlefield became unpredictable, chaotic, and terrifying for the defenders. Across Normandy, German soldiers radioed desperate messages back to their commanders. Tanks everywhere. Armor breakthrough. We cannot hold the line. Many of these messages were intercepted by Allied intelligence, confirming what American troops already knew. The Shermans were overwhelming the Germans with mobility, numbers, and persistence. Not by being stronger individually, but by being everywhere at once. The German belief that Allied tanks were inferior collapsed in a matter of hours. The Sherman, once mocked, became a symbol of unstoppable progress, rolling through fire, mud, and explosions as it led the Allies deeper into France. German troops fighting at Normandy were experiencing the beginning of the end. Their anti-tank guns overheated, their ammunition ran low, and their positions were overrun as waves of Shermans and infantry continued advancing relentlessly. And yet, this was only the beginning of what the Germans would face. Because the American strategy in Normandy was not simply to use tanks as weapons, it was to use them as the driving force of a new kind of warfare. What began on the beaches would soon expand into something far larger, far more coordinated, and far more devastating than the Germans had expected. As the American advance expanded beyond the first lines of the Normandy beaches, the German troops realized that the Sherman tanks were not simply tools of breakthrough. They were the backbone of a relentless armored strategy. The Germans, who had survived the initial beach assaults, regrouped further inland, believing that they could mount a counterattack and push the Allies back into the sea. But the nature of the battlefield had changed. Normandy was no longer a defensive terrain favoring fortified positions. It had become a battleground of mobility, coordination, and rapid firepower, and this was where the Shermans excelled in ways the Germans had not anticipated. In the days following D-Day, the German High Command rushed to deploy their panzer divisions to contain the Allied advance. Tiger tanks, Panthers, and assault guns like the Stug III were sent to meet the incoming American forces. These armored vehicles were legends, feared across Europe for their thick armor and devastating guns. German tank crews believed that their superior machines would easily destroy the supposedly inferior Sherman, and in one-on-one combat, they often could. But what they were not prepared for was the sheer scale at which the Allies deployed their armor. By the time German panzers reached Normandy, American Shermans were already flooding the countryside in overwhelming numbers. For every Tiger the Germans could field, the Americans fielded dozens of Shermans. For every Panther rolling through French villages, there were entire columns of Shermans pushing forward through the hedgerows. Even if a German tank managed to destroy several Shermans in a single engagement, the Americans always had more coming. The German troops began to realize that this war was no longer about individual machine superiority. It was about production, supply, and coordination on a level the Reich simply could not match. Sherman tanks were everywhere. They patrolled roads, secured crossroads, protected supply lines, and formed armored wedges during offensives. Their engines echoed across the countryside day and night, a constant reminder to German troops that the Allies were growing stronger by the hour. The Germans attempted ambushes, using the thick hedgerows as natural camouflage. They positioned anti-tank guns behind narrow lanes, hoping to catch Shermans in kill zones. And while many tanks did fall victim to these traps, the Americans adapted quickly. Infantry and tanks worked together with increasing precision. Engineers cleared paths. Recon units scouted ahead. Artillery supported every movement. The Germans found themselves facing not just tanks, but an entire integrated system of warfare. One of the most demoralizing discoveries for the Germans was the speed of Allied repairs. A Sherman knocked out in combat could often be salvaged, repaired, and returned to the battlefield in a matter of days. American logistics were unmatched. Replacement parts arrived constantly. Fuel trucks kept the armor moving. Mechanics worked tirelessly behind the lines. Meanwhile, German tanks, especially Tigers and Panthers, broke down frequently and were difficult to repair. Their replacement parts were scarce, their fuel supplies dwindling, and their maintenance crews overwhelmed. A damaged German tank often meant a permanently lost asset. A damaged Sherman often meant another tank returning to battle soon. German field reports from Normandy reveal growing frustration and disbelief. Officers wrote that Allied tanks seemed to reappear as fast as they were destroyed. Infantry units reported being surrounded by armor before they even knew the scale of the enemy's advance. Some German soldiers described the sensation as fighting a steel tide, constant, unstoppable, and emotionally exhausting. The psychological pressure of facing waves of Shermans took a toll. Exhausted and undersupplied, many German troops began withdrawing from positions they might otherwise have defended. In the small towns and villages of Normandy, the Shermans became symbols of liberation to French civilians and symbols of fear to the occupying German forces. The tanks rolled through narrow streets, knocking aside debris, rubble, and barricades. Their guns fired at enemy positions hidden in stone buildings, clearing paths for infantry to follow German snipers. Machine gunners and anti-tank teams attempted to halt their progress, but each time they did, the Shermans returned with greater strength. The Hedgerow fighting became one of the defining challenges of the Normandy campaign. German troops, familiar with the terrain, believed they held the advantage. The hedgerows created natural fortresses, thick walls of earth and vegetation sometimes taller than a man, almost impossible to see or fire through. Tanks attempting to climb over them often exposed their vulnerable undersides. For days, the Shermans struggled against this terrain, and the Germans felt confident that they had finally found a way to halt the American advance. But innovation changed everything. American soldiers devised a simple yet brilliant modification, welding metal prongs and blades onto the front of Sherman tanks to cut through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. These modified tanks, nicknamed Rhino Shermans, became nightmare machines for German defenders. No longer safe behind the hedgerows, German troops watched in shock as the earth split open and Shermans burst through like predators emerging from hidden tunnels. Entire ambush positions were neutralized instantly. The hedgerow advantage vanished almost overnight. As the Americans pushed deeper inland, they began launching larger offensives designed to break the German lines entirely. Operations like Cobra demonstrated the full power of Allied mobility. Before the Shermans advanced, massive air bombardment shattered German defensive positions, scattering troops, destroying equipment, and leaving entire sectors in chaos. Then the tank struck, fast, coordinated, and unstoppable. German units that survived the initial blasts often found Shermans bearing down on them before they could regroup. The German troops encountered a new challenge: the American ability to exploit breakthroughs rapidly. Once a gap appeared, columns of Shermans poured through it with incredible speed. They spread out across the countryside, flanking German positions, cutting off retreat routes, and surrounding pockets of resistance. Many German defenders reported feeling as though they were fighting blind, unable to anticipate where the next armored thrust would come from. Communications broke down. Reinforcements arrived too late. The front line collapsed not because the Germans lacked courage, but because they lacked the mobility and resources to match the Allied armored advance. Throughout the campaign, the myth of German armored invincibility continued to crumble. Panthers suffered mechanical failures. Tigers became trapped in mud or narrow roads. Fuel shortages immobilized entire battalions. The Sherman, however, thrived. It was not perfect. It was not the strongest tank. But it was reliable, fast, maneuverable, and available in overwhelming numbers. And most importantly, it operated within a war machine designed for victory on an industrial scale. By late July and August, German troops defending Normandy faced a grim reality. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly surrounded. The Shermans spearheaded pushes that encircled large German forces, trapping them in pockets like the Falaise pocket. German soldiers attempting to escape found roads blocked by American armor, fields swarming with tanks, and artillery pounding their retreat routes. For many, surrender became the only option. Others died fighting in desperate last stands. The battlefield was filled with burned-out vehicles, destroyed equipment, and the remnants of units that had once been the pride of the German army. The psychological impact of the Sherman cannot be overstated. German soldiers wrote in letters and diaries that the constant sound of tank engines haunted them. They feared encountering another armored column every time they moved positions. The knowledge that the Americans had seemingly endless reserves of tanks and men created a sense of hopelessness that spread throughout the ranks. The belief that the war could still be won slowly faded. As the Allies finally broke out of Normandy and began racing across France, the Shermans led the way. They liberated towns, smashed through German positions, and formed the core of armored divisions that moved faster than the Germans could respond Every mile the Allies advanced was another reminder of the Sherman's effectiveness. Not as the strongest tank, but as the most decisive. By the time the Normandy campaign ended, Germany had lost thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of troops, and its most valuable defensive positions in France. The German troops who had once mocked the Sherman now understood that they had misjudged their enemy. The Americans had brought not just tanks, but a strategy, a supply chain, and an industrial force unmatched in the war. And at the heart of that force was the Sherman tank. It was the machine that pushed through the beaches, broke the hedgerows, shattered the defensive lines, and carried the Allied armies across France. German troops were not simply stunned by the Sherman. They were overwhelmed, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated by the unstoppable momentum it helped create. The story of Normandy is not just a story of invasion or strategy. It is the story of how a tank once underestimated became one of the most important instruments of liberation in modern history.